Okay, so this PowerPoint we're going to be discussing Africa before and around 1500. As you can see from these maps, about 1450 is when Europeans really started coming into Africa, and you could tell how quickly the map changed. This is a very quick pace of changing a map from what they thought it looked like to what it actually was, and it didn't take them long. It is somewhat important to point out that before 1450 there was very little outside influence on Africa, except for the Muslim world. And when I say Muslim world, I mean southern Spain and mostly Arabia. So keep that in mind. Okay, so after 1100, slavery became the basic feature of society in North Africa, Ethiopia, the East Coast, and the West African savanna. Some North Africans even boasted that they owned more than 5,000 slaves, and these are slaves in the sense of the word that we think of them as slaves. Most of them were chattel. Some could get their freedom and become prosperous, but for the most part, these were people who were taken from their home and made into slaves. As you can see from the route, there are trade routes established by Muslim traders, and they would go throughout Africa and trade rice, timber, gold, silver, whatever other natural resources that they had, and they would trade those for slaves, and then they would take them back. Some went to the Middle East, what we would consider the Middle East today, and some were even shipped off as far as India. This is around 1100. Some numbers for you from 700 to 1500, before the Europeans really had a grasp of Africa. 7 million people, mostly women, were sold to harems as house servants, and another 2 million were sent to the Middle East and Arabia. That's a large amount of people for that time period. So what I want you to get out of this is there was already a slave trade and a slave society intact when Europeans got to Africa, which we'll discuss a lot more later, but it basically meant that the Europeans had an easy time creating a slave trade because it was already there. Some of the purposes for the slaves, especially slaves of Muslims as opposed to slaves of Europeans, they basically had 3 purposes. One was domestic service, which is self-explanatory, right? That's maids, servants, people who clean the house, anything you can think of that would make a wealthy person's life easy. The second one would be oarsmen, because really before the Europeans got to Africa, the way you move ships was with manual labor. You guys have all seen movies or whatever of men rowing boats, Sweden, even Scandinavians, what have you. So that they were very important in that way. And the third important way that they were used was in concentration of population, which meant that you would move a whole bunch of people from one place to another because a plantation would go up, or you would have a mine there. So you needed to move people from one place to another, a large amount of people. Kind of like how America built the railroad in that sense, right? You just keep moving these people along and put them to work. Other than that, those were the 3 main reasons to have slaves. And the other thing that I want you to think about is the slave trade itself. We've already talked about globalization and things of that nature, but the slave trade itself is something that made the global economy run. Right? Once the Europeans conquered the New World, what did they need? They needed more human beings, right? So when we think about the idea of globalization and the global economy, cheap labor is the one thing that really pushed the global economy after 1450, right? And this is taking people from one place and moving them to another and exploiting them for their work. And it wasn't just people from Africa, right? The British sent their convicts to Australia and to Georgia, by the way. A lot of British convicts were sent to Georgia to work on plantations and mines there. Russians used their prisoners to build things in Siberia. The Chinese moved for railroads. The Irish were driven from Britain, and they moved to America and worked. So it's not just this idea of Africans, but it is also that the global economy was really, really pushed by this movement of people for work. So here's just a picture of kind of the African empires, and we'll talk about a few of these empires later, and you can kind of see what type of products each area had, right? You have salt in the Sahara, copper, gold, ivory in the south, slaves and gold on the west coast, things like that. Okay, so let's talk about some African religion before we get into the actual civilizations themselves. A lot of this you will see in your book, Things Fall Apart, kind of how this religion plays a role in their lives. The nation itself is a very spiritual and thoughtful nation, or continent. There isn't a single African religion that prevails, but each culture kind of has its own set of wisdom, prophecies, principle beliefs, that govern behavior. Each tribe has its own 10 commandments, so to speak. They may not be 10 commandments literally, but something along those lines. Each have their own mores and customs. For instance, it's a bad idea to have twins in some societies, but you go 200 miles away and it would be a blessing. Okay, so it's just dependent on where you live and what your tribe believes. But one thing that most religions do have is this supreme being, and it's an integral part of society. It's usually the Almighty, creative force, who's omnipresent, omniscient, and the ultimate judge of things. So it's a greater being, and there are different names for it: Mawu, Nyame, Chukwu, but no matter what the name for this supreme being is, and sometimes it's male, sometimes it's female, each society has one. Almost all believe that a person is born free of sin and has a soul, and you can get close to this supreme being through sacrifice, prayer, and divination. And the people who lead the divination are called diviners, and I believe you'll see this in the book. These were mediums who were concerned with moral order, meaning they were mediums between the living and the dead, and they were concerned with the moral order and relations between man and the spiritual realm, and they also were consulted on things. They were all kind of the doctors as well, because they were consulted on fertility, destiny, anything of that nature. For the most part, most religions also believe that a human being has an individual access to the Supreme Being, and that everyone possessed a guardian and should serve it well. And when it means guardian, is exactly what it means. It's kind of like our guardian angels, so to speak. These guardians had names. They were loaded with symbolism and meaning. For example, the Yoruba tribe had a common name for boys called Olaguna, which means God straightens the path, and everyone had access to him. Also, at the same time, they were ancestors were venerated, like most civilizations in most societies. There was ancestor worship. They were venerated. They were looked to for philosophical and spiritual guidance. Your ancestors actually owned the land, and they shaped the behavior of the land that you lived in, and they provided that community for you. So to be cut off from your ancestors would be to be cut off from life itself. Okay, so ancestors were very important and still are today. There's also this belief in a vital force, and there's 4 different classifications of the vital force. There's the Muntu, which means it's a classification, and this means man, ancestors, and gods. So that's the top of the vital force. Below that is the Kintu, which means plants, animals, and rocks. Below that would be Hantu, which is time and space. And then below that is Kuntu, which is manner or modality, which basically, that's the most abstract of all of them. It's basically how you live your life. Okay, so everything on Earth possesses a vital force, whether it's an animate or inanimate object, what we would consider animate or inanimate. Okay, but the most sacred of all things was the Earth. The Earth was generally associated with the female, and it was the most important thing, and if you treated the Earth well, then good things would happen to you. They also, what goes with this is the idea of animism. I don't know if how many of you have heard of that or not, but this is basically the idea that non-human entities are spiritual beings, and so whether it's your pet dog, your cat, whatever it is, just because you are not human does not mean that you do not have a soul and you do not have a spirit. That is the main difference, I think, and it's quite a bit different. So when the Muslims and Christians got to Africa, they tried to change a lot of this, although a lot of this sounds a lot like Islam and Christianity, but for the most part they tried to change this, but they really didn't make that many inroads until about 1800, and even into today many African nations, tribes still live by these customs and these religious practices. Okay, we're just going to look at a few empires real quickly just so you get the idea that these were intricate civilizations when the Europeans actually landed on the continent. The first one we're going to look at real quick is the Songhai Empire, and as you can see, this was an expansive empire. In fact, at 1550, it was one of the largest empires in the world. Sunni Ali is the man who created it and made it this large, but actually it was a slave, Muhammad Toure, who staged a brilliant coup against Sunni Ali and made it an Islamic political machine, really. As you can tell from their names, these are Muslims. Toure made ministries for the army, fisheries, forestry, taxing, ministries for public works, things like that. He created what we would consider to be a bureaucracy today. He created a government. He had provinces that he handpicked the governors. He established huge plantations that were very much like the plantations that we would think of coming from South America or the South. He created a system of weights and measures, and basically what that is instead of using bartering for everything, he created the idea that this much gold means this much, it's worth this much money, and that's what you're going to pay with. So he basically created this monetary society built around money, which is much more efficient than a society based on trading 2 pots for 1 pot or something like that. So he made it very uniform, and he made the economy skyrocket. When you make a society and it's stable, then that generates more revenue, which generates more taxes, which makes makes the society more prosperous. So Toure was also, he created huge mosques for theology, law, math, and medicine. So he was very interested in education as well. His grandson, Askia Daud, was basically, this was the time when the Songhai Empire reached its zenith, but what ended up happening is it actually got too big, and with help from the Europeans, a lot of the nomadic tribes from the north, what we would consider Morocco today, that area, and from the Western Sudan, they came in and kind of started raiding, and the empire got too big, and it actually ended up crumbling. There's evidence that there were quite a few Portuguese, because they, as we'll discuss later, war meant slaves, so the Portuguese kind of started a war so they could get more slaves. It's a interesting concept, and one that the Europeans did very well. Okay, so the other empire we'll talk about quickly is the Kingdom of Congo, and it's an interesting one, not only because of its longevity, but because one of the kings and his son really tried to turn it into a Catholic empire on the west side of Africa. In 1500, it was the largest kingdom in West Africa, and the Portuguese had made contact with his name is King Nzinga, in 1483, and he was so impressed with their guns and their armor and things that their war-making capability, that he decided to go and visit Portugal, and he did, and in 1491 he comes back with priests, artisans, soldiers, and a printing press, which was an amazing discovery at the time for them. He converted to Catholicism, and his son, who was christened Alfonso, was actually educated in Portugal and came back and was the first black Catholic bishop in world history. The Portuguese also brought guns, horses, cattle, like I said, the printing press, but most importantly, they brought ideas. And what happened is Alfonso tried to convert most people to Catholicism, but what that did was it kind of brought friction and dissension and social instability, because many of the African people did not want to become Catholic, and they did not want to become subservient to the Portuguese. Even though he was Catholic, Alfonso also did not want slave traders in his kingdom, and that's kind of why Portugal wanted to help them so much, is because they knew that there was a ton of slave people on the west coast that they could take with them and take to the New World. With that in mind, it didn't take long. Alfonso's cousin came to the throne as king, but in 1556 they actually went to war with a little place called Angola. And once again, just like the Portuguese did in Songhai, they created this tension between these two empires, and Angola actually invaded the Kingdom of Congo, and the real beneficiaries of this war were the Portuguese, because out of it came prisoners of war, and prisoners of war in Africa became slaves. So the people who benefited most from that war were the Portuguese. And most of the reason why there was this need for more slaves was because in the New World, especially in Brazil, the Portuguese and the Spanish were starting to open mines, and mines were very hard, very deadly work, and the need for more human beings just grew every day. So, in essence, the Europeans were creating these wars to get prisoners of war so they could take them to Brazil. And here's just the slave routes from 1550. You can see that not all of them were on the west coast. If you look at the map, especially in the Sahara, the kind of the northern piece of Africa, you can see that they took them up towards the Mediterranean, and then they were either used as slaves in the Mediterranean, or they were taken to Britain, or they were taken across the Middle East into Asia. So as you can tell from that map, long-distance trading networks were already in place when the Europeans finally made it to the continent and into the continent. These networks, they went across the Sahara, along the coast, through the river valleys. Canoemen traveled through the deltas down to the Ivory Coast, between the Gold Coast and the Congo on the west side of Africa. They were exchanging salt and fish for yams, goats, and cattle or camels. There was a large trade for textile, salt, and copper. Around 1200, African cotton became very popular in Italy because, as you guys know, cotton is much more lighter and much more comfortable to wear than wool. So African cotton became very popular in Europe. But after 1500, the nature of trade kind of changed. Around 1500, European goods started flooding the market. So people like fishers or brewers, beer was very important. Beer was a very important source of energy and carbohydrates. Salt, anything that you would trade, the Europeans traded for, mostly slaves. But the problem with this is the nature of trade changed. So when Europeans flooded the market, what they flooded the African market with was guns and gunpowder. So in essence, what was happening is the Europeans were bringing guns into Africa and gunpowder and ammo, and they were trading that for humans, and they were trading that for all of the natural resources of Africa, and all the Africans were getting were guns and gunpowder. Here's an example. From 1600 to 1700, at least 20 million guns were exported to the Sahara region alone. And so the reason that there are quite a few other numbers, but the main point I want to get across here is the reason that Africans were willing to give up all of their natural resources, especially their human resources, is for guns, is because guns allowed you to go out and hunt and find more slaves, more prisoners of war. And that is what people call the gun slave cycle, which is the idea that the Europeans traded with states and other guerrilla groups, other tribes. They traded guns for slaves. But the whole idea is that you're trading guns for slaves. Your competitor is going to need more guns, so they're going to trade more guns, and they're going to get more guns, and then you're going to have to get more guns. And so what was happening is Africa became a nation that was trading everything it had for guns, and it was a very heavily armed continent. And so that's what the gun slave cycle means. It's just this circular thing where you need more guns to get more slaves, and then your competitor gets more guns, so they get more slaves. And it was just a vicious cycle. And a lot of people think that this really pushed African civilization back hundreds of years. The real cost, here I'll give you some numbers about the real cost of a slave. In London, at about the turn of the 16th century, a slave was worth 600 pounds of sugar or 16 guns, but you could get one in Africa for 8 guns. So if you had the ships and the know-how and the courage to go down there you could basically double your profits, at least double, triple, quadruple your profits every time you went down there. You just had to have the right equipment. 600 pounds of sugar or 16 guns, a slave would produce that well over that in 1 year of work. So even though it sounds like a lot of sugar, slaves were very important, and you could make a bunch of money off them. It's just one. You could trade 10 slaves for one horse. Horses became very important in Africa. So if you were somehow a European and you could get your hands on some horses, you could trade one horse for 10 slaves. And so this cycle just keeps. And what you needed horses for was to run down other people, so you could make them slaves and then trade your African kinsmen to Europeans for guns and horses to get more slaves. So it was an interesting cycle, and one that really hurt the African continent quite a bit. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the triangular trade and real quick, and then we'll just go through maybe the procedure of what a slave would look like. But first I want to talk about royal charter companies, which, as many of you did on your first assignment when you defined mercantilism, it's the royal charter company is just the epitome of what mercantilism is. And we've already discussed sugar, so we don't need to talk about that anymore. Basically, what the Royal Charter Company was is this was a company. It was either an individual or a corporation who was formally issued the right to trade by the monarch, and it was a state-run monopoly. So, for instance, what came out of these charter companies, and this is this is in Britain at first, and then other countries do this, is something called the Royal African Company. So from 1672 to 1700, this Royal African Company had the monarch's approval to trade slaves, and nobody else could do it from the country of Britain. So when I talk about a state-run monopoly, that means that Britain provided soldiers, weapons, sometimes ships, doctors, medicines, advisors, things of that nature, to this company to help them with the slave trade. If you were from Britain and you were caught in the slave trade and you weren't part of the Royal African Company, you would be executed. This was a very, very important tool due to opening up Africa even more than it already had. And around 1650 is really when the slave trade opened up in Africa. And we discussed why the Portuguese kind of had left. They hadn't really left, but they hadn't expended too much energy in the slave trade because they wanted to be in India, and they were more interested in gold than anything, in spices. But the British, by 1650, and we'll talk about the Revolution and how Britain became so powerful, but by 1650 they're the most powerful country in the world, and they have the best navy, and they have one of the most stable governments as well. So this is a country with a very good navy and a very stable government, and they granted this African company the monopoly on the slave trade. The leader of the Royal African Company was a man called the Duke of York. So many of the slaves that were traded for or bought on the west coast of Africa would get a brand with the DY, which meant Duke of York, meaning they belonged to him. And when I say brand, I mean an actual brand. And a lot of you have been around livestock, and when you brand something, you do that to tell people that it's yours. Okay, so many of these slaves who came to the Americas would have the brand DY on their bodies. Some people argue that the state-run monopoly was actually, as far as the slave trade goes, not a terrible thing, because they argue that when you only have one company doing it, it keeps the actual number of people who are being traded for slavery or other goods down. So, for example, from 1672 to 1689, the Royal African Company transported anywhere from 90,000 to 150,000 slaves, which is still a large amount of people when you consider 17 years. If you go 120,000 slaves, that's 8,000 people a year, something around there, and there's 365 days in the year, so that tells you how many people are being moved every day. Whether that's a good argument or not, but the truth is once the Royal African Company lost its charter, and other people could trade, the actual numbers of the slave trade went up exponentially. The 1700s were a very bad year for the slave trade as far as numbers are concerned. So the argument somewhat holds, but at the same time, it's still the slave trade. So when we talk about the triangular trade, this is a very good idea of what mercantilism is because what you would do if, let's say, if you're Britain or the Royal African Company, is, and you can see, you traded your textiles or your alcohol or your manufactured goods or your horses to African countries for slaves and gold. You would take these slaves to, then you would take these slaves to the Americas, and you would keep the gold, and then you would trade your slaves for sugar, tobacco, and cotton, and then you would send those back to Britain with the gold and the goods, and then you would make things out of that. You would keep the gold, make things out of your cotton and other textiles, and then you would make them, and then you would go down and you would trade them for more slaves. So that's what the idea of mercantilism is. You're producing goods, you're bringing in gold, and you're keeping the gold, and you're trading the goods you produce for more gold. Okay? So the British were very good at that. And this is why Marx calls slavery the rosy dawn of capitalism. So that's what the triangle trade is. They did have quite a few problems, for instance, because a lot of times these companies had ships that were made to carry humans. So humans were the heaviest commodity that they traded with besides gold, but you didn't really get enough gold to compensate for that. So what you would do is you would load your ship with humans, and it would cross from Africa to America, which is called the Middle Passage. But then when you unloaded all these humans, you couldn't get enough. Cotton doesn't weigh that much. Sugar or tobacco, neither does tobacco. You couldn't get enough of that to fill your boat. So what ended up happening is you had to put ballast in your boat. So you lost a lot of space because of that. So there was that. There was also the idea that when you transported, and sometimes it took longer than it should have, so sometimes you arrive out of season, and people didn't need slaves, or a lot of times people died on the way over there, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, the Middle Passage. But there were a lot of tricky things to this, and so it was very intricate, and it was something that, it was a risk that you had to take, but in the end it benefited the Europeans and the Americans far more than it benefited the Africans. Real quick, we'll just go through what a slave market would look like. This is from a Dutch source. He writes about how even though he kind of understands that trading human beings isn't that good of a thing to do, he says, but yeah, our ships are the cleanest and we're the nicest. We hardly ever beat them. We hardly ever brand them. Kind of idea. So what would happen is the Africans would bring the slaves to an auction, and they'd be put in a prison. And so while they're there in the prison, if you were Dutch, then you would use your doctor. If you were British, you would use your doctor, whatever. And you would have your own surgeon check both the men and the women. And the men and the women are naked, standing in prison. Those who are approved would be set aside, and those who are invalids would be called macaroons. And to be an invalid would be, if you were too old, usually age 35 or above, if you had a maimed arm, leg, hand, or foot, if you had all your teeth missing, gray hair, film over your eyes, meaning you had some type of maybe disease when you were younger, or you were in the stages of having a disease, you wouldn't be worth that much money, or anything else along those lines. So once these people are picked, approved, they're numbered. It says who delivered them, which slave trader delivered them, and usually then that's when you would brand them to make sure that not only that they don't get lost, but also to make sure that once you paid for them, that the people who are watching the prisons didn't trade them while they were waiting, or obviously if they ran away, then you could say that is my property. And so this Dutch guy writes, it may seem barbaric, but it's a necessity. So once that happens, they're returned to prison, and then while they're waiting for all of, while you're waiting to have enough slaves to fill your ship, these slaves you have already bought are still sitting in these prisons or these jails, waiting for you to buy enough slaves to fill your ship up. So the person who had just bought the slave had to pay every day to give them bread. And so once you got enough slaves to fill your boat, you would strip them again, you'd bring them on board naked, and then there are some pictures. Then you would just file them into your boat, and you would take them to the Americas. This Dutch man says that on the trip over, they're fed 3 times a day. The men and women were usually kept apart on the boats for obvious reasons, and they tried to put as many people in as possible. There were mutinies, but for the most part those did not work, because obviously the Europeans on the boats were armed and they knew how to sail a ship of that size, whereas if the Africans did take the ship over, they would have had a hard time. They didn't know where they were going, and they would have had a hard time sailing the ship anyways. So that's kind of one example of what a slave market is, and so that kind of gives you some background as to what it was all about and how it became such a huge deal to the Europeans. And what I really do want you to get out of this is that not only did the Europeans trade these slaves, but it was already well in place by the time they got there, so they really had to do very little to get the human power that they needed to run their plantations and mines in the New World. And now we're going to the end of this PowerPoint. And so the next PowerPoint will conclude. We'll talk about a few more kingdoms, and we'll just kind of talk about the slave trade debate, and we'll go into a few numbers of just kind of the legacy of slavery and how it set back the African continent.